Okay, hello again, everybody. This is going to be the third lecture on Jonson's Bartholomew Fair. There will be one more after this. I didn't want it to turn out that way, but it has. Um, there's just an awful lot of material to cover in this very strange, but I hope you would agree with me, at least to some extent, kind of wonderful play where Jonson's having a lot of fun and having a lot of fun with us. Um, Last time I was mostly talking about Act 1 of Jonson's play, and I was talking about this strange transition that the play is about. A transition between the ordinary world that we live in and walk around in all the time, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, and this other world, this festive world that we go into when we enter a festival space, a concert space, when we enter a party space, when we enter an art space such as a playhouse or a cinema. This is the contrast, the transition that Jonson is trying to think about and write about in giving us a play called Bartholomew Fair, representing that particular very famous festive occasion of early modern London coming along once a year on August 24th in the open area of the city known as Smithfield. And this phenomenon of festive time, I was suggesting over the last couple of lectures that, well, two things. One, it's historically a really, really big deal in early modern English culture and European culture generally. A culture which was marked, punctuated by a rhythm of festivity, where ordinary transitions to festive, where every day transitions to holiday and then transitions back again. I was also suggesting, and I don't know if this is the case because I'm not an anthropologist, but I was suggesting that it would make sense at least to have, to guess or assume that this rhythm of the ordinary and the festive would be universal to human culture. I think it would be very, very surprising and fascinating if there were a human culture that didn't have any festivity, or on the other hand, if there were a human culture that didn't have any ordinariness, that always lived under festive conditions. And by that token, when we're looking at Bartholomew Fair and the issues that Jonson is bringing up and trying to grasp in Bartholomew Fair, I think we can say with confidence that we are looking at issues that are familiar to us and issues that matter to us. And not because we care about Jonson or about English literature, but just because we're human beings moving around in our own version of human culture. So we recognize this rhythm, this transition that we undergo when we go from work to a party, when we go from the street to the cinema, when we go, as I've said, from everyday to holiday and then back again. And of course we have to go back, even if we don't want to. And as has been remarked in the past, if you go from everyday to holiday and come back to everyday, that's festivity. If you go from everyday to holiday and never come back, that's a revolution, for good and for ill. So that's the kind of historical and anthropological workup that we can give to this, I think, extremely interesting and important and tantalizing topic of festivity. And we can then theorize it a little farther along those lines that I've been sketching from the beginning of our course. We're trying to kind of reach that theoretical side of the swimming pool, and that theoretical side for us in a case like this one is going to be more or less phenomenological. It's going to be consistent with that aspect of philosophy. Phenomenologically then, and we don't need to worry about what that means, that's just That's just a word that almost has to be there, and we could follow it up, but we won't. But we're talking about the shape of our experience, the fundamental shape of our experience of the world. That's what phenomenology means. Phenomenologically, when we look at the contrast between the ordinary and the festive, between everyday and holiday, we're looking very remarkably, I think, at an experience and an apprehension of, let's say, two modes of time. And there's nothing mystical or strange about this. In a sense, it's the most ordinary thing in the world, this transition from the ordinary to the festive. That's ordinary, not festive. It's not mystical, it's typical, it's familiar, and yet by exactly that token it is, I think, extremely strange and extremely important. We inhabit these two modes of time, the ordinary or everyday on the one hand, the holiday or the festive on the other. And insofar as we take the ordinary, and I think we have to, insofar as we take the ordinary to be the baseline or the norm, we have to look at the festive from the perspective of the ordinary, and what we perceive, of course, is the festive is when the ordinary is suspended. Holiday is when every day is suspended. And what that means in practice and means morally is, of course, our everyday lives are governed by rules and laws and norms and disciplines. Festive time is when we set aside or perhaps even invert the rules, and I talked about this in a previous lecture. Paradoxically, and there's a couple of paradoxes here, one paradox is that the laying aside or inversion of the rules in festive time, that itself becomes a kind of rule, right? And we see this very clearly in things like drinking games, but even more generally, if you are in a festive space, if you're at a party or something, and you are working on your term paper for English 310, you are breaking a rule, and you will be called out for it by your friends. At the same time, and this is another paradox, festive space, festive time itself has to be contained or controlled by rules to some extent, because if it isn't, it of course always has a tendency to go too far. So we want to have a good time, not too good a time. We want to go crazy a little bit, not too crazy in festive time. We want to get messed up. Maybe we even want to make a mess a little bit in the context of festive time. But we don't want to get messed with. We don't want to become a mess. And hopefully we don't want to mess with others either in that festive context. We don't want anybody to get hurt. And people getting hurt, as we all know from rueful experience, people getting hurt is a possibility that is very much imminent within every single occasion of festive time that we experience. So this cultural phenomenon of festivity, I'm trying to suggest in a general way, and before we come back to looking at Jonson's play, this cultural phenomenon of festivity, to put it trivially, it's a really big deal, this phenomenon. And I also would probably suggest that it is a big deal, which in various ways that I think we don't need to go into, but I'll just make this suggestion. In various ways, I think this is a big deal, cultural and phenomenological, that is specially, if not uniquely, made available for our contemplation and our analysis in the literary classroom specifically. Let me just suggest that without even trying to make that suggestion good. I'll just lay it out there. And a term we can attach to this initial preliminary discussion this evening I've just been saying that festivity is paradoxical in the sense that it is a laying aside or an inversion of the rules, and yet in several ways that festive inversion itself turns out to have and to respond to rules. Early modern English culture specifically had a term very familiar to them, um, which designated, let's say, this paradox of the festive matrix. The term is misrule, M-I-S rule. And on the festive occasions that marked early modern English culture, some of the most famous of these occasions, there would actually be appointed what's called a Lord of Misrule. That means somebody who's in charge of the party. Make sure that you follow the rules of the drinking games, and yet also at the same time make sure that the party doesn't get too far out of hand, doesn't go into that kind of negative territory. So misrule, the rule of no rule, or the management of the absence of rules. That's a wonderful and worth knowing early modern English term, designating and describing this paradoxical area of festivity. So that's the territory that we're on with Jonson's Bartholomew Fair. And it's worth, I guess, pausing and reflecting over some of the aspects of Jonson that we have learned about over the last 13 weeks. And we don't study Jonson very much anymore because, as we have learned, he's a bit of a difficult guy to make friends with. But I do think, and as I've suggested several times in our course, we learn a lot if we can find ways to make friends with Jonson. He himself in life was a highly festive person who nonetheless was committed to, as we have discussed, a very conservative version of humanist discipline. Every man out of his humor, the last text that we looked at, that's, if you like, I would say, a conservative Jonson. A Jonson under control and committed to a vision of authorial control. Bartholomew Fair, maybe, is a more festive Jonson. A Jonson who is saying, if you will forgive the expression, fuck it. And yet, by exactly that token, and this is wonderfully mysterious, by exactly that token, it becomes very difficult, I think, to grasp how Jonson himself feels about that. So regrettably, I, as the person who is attempting to teach this material, I'm probably going to have to cop out a lot and talk about ambiguity and things being slippery and mercurial and so on and so forth. But I believe that is demanded by the phenomenon of festivity itself and by Jonson's attempt to put on the stage a play about that phenomenon. Okay, let's try to get past, let me try to get past these preliminary and theoretical registers and get us into talking about some details of the play, okay? I spent a lot of time on Act 1 in the last lecture. We're going to go on, necessarily, and talk about Act 2 of the play. Act 2 begins by introducing to us a new character. This man's name is Adam Overdue. He's a justice of the peace, so a judge, a legal figure. He comes on per the stage direction, and this is also carried forward in his lines. He comes on in disguise, and there's a bit of a minor kind of issue here, because how do you even know that a character you've never seen before is in disguise? But nonetheless, let's just let that pass. He's disguised as a kind of fool, rubby, homeless person, let's say. And it turns out later on that he's recognizable to the denizens of Bartlemy Fair as a kind of crazy a homeless person with whom they are familiar under the name of Arthur Bradley. So Adam Overdue is a judge in the real world, outside the world of the fair. He's also a judge in the festival world of the fair itself. Bartlemy Fair, and this is an amazingly wonderful historical tidbit, I think. Bartlemy Fair had its own like little legal system. It had its own court, what's called in the play and in history, it was called the Court of Pie Powders, which sounds absolutely fantastic. It's from a law French expression meaning dusty feet, pieds poudres. The Court of Pie Powders. So Bartlemy Fair had its own temporary legal system for dealing with people who were violating the rules of festivity in one of the two ways that we have just talked about, either going a little too far, getting a little too crazy, or perhaps not being crazy enough, not participating in the world of festivity. And so this is Adam Overdue, this figure whom we meet at the beginning of Act 2, a justice of the peace who also, for many years, has presided over the Court of Pie Powders in Bartlemy Fair itself. However, Adam Overdue tells us in his long opening speech, and he's very given to long soliloquies, Adam Overdue tells us that he is dissatisfied with the justice he has been able to mete out, both in the real world and in Bartlemy Fair, basically because he feels that he is not getting good information. And accordingly, he's going incognito as a fool or madman in order to see what is going on. Now, festivity, as we have said, festivity involves a kind of moral inversion. It also, especially in the early modern period, festivity involves a degree of, let's say, pleasurable dishonesty. It involved things like dressing up, pretending to be people that you are not, cross-dressing, stuff like that. So Overdue, coming on in disguise, is quite an intriguing and again paradoxical figure. He's coming on in disguise in order not to participate in the world of Bartlemy Fair, if you see what I mean. He wants to go incognito so that he can see what's really going on in the fair. And yet, by exactly that token, by coming on in disguise, he's participating willy-nilly in the festive world of the fair, pretending to be somebody whom he is not. And as you guys will have noticed from the reading, one thing that happens to Adam Overdue repeatedly in Bartlemy Fair is that he gets drawn into festive activities and even becomes the butt of festive activities, getting beaten, getting put in the stocks and stuff like that. Nonetheless, Overdue justifies what he's doing, justifies his dishonesty, which he is frank about. He justifies his dishonesty as having a moral purpose. He says there is a doing of right out of wrong. A doing of right out of wrong. And maybe that's one way to try to understand the moral inversion that takes place in festivity. Although certainly I would want to suggest that there will be more than one way to try to understand that very, very difficult anthropological and phenomenological topic. So Overdue thinks he's not really part of the fair at all. He's just there. He's just pretending to be there, so to speak, pretending to participate. And so the question therefore arises, can you in fact pretend to go to a party? The answer that I think comes out of Overdue in Jonson's play, the answer seems to be no. He is dressed as a fool, just as Overdue, and in fact, as we see very clearly as we read through the play, he is a fool. He is a pompous idiot, saturated with good conservative classical humanism, by the way, which is a very interesting moment or aspect of Jonson, perhaps turning that satirical figure back upon himself. But Overdue is a pompous idiot who constantly misapprehends or misunderstands what's going on. He becomes very attached, for example, to this young man called Ezekiel Edgeworth, whom Overdue thinks is a proper young gentleman who's being misled by the denizens of the fair. Of course, as we know from the very beginning, Ezekiel Edgeworth is actually a pickpocket, a cut purse. So he is one of the very lowest and most malicious scumbags of the festive space. Overdue doesn't see that at all, for all of his attempt to go incognito and get pure, clean information about what's going on here. And as I've said already, for his trouble, Overdue gets beaten, he gets put in the stocks, he becomes a figure of fun. So we have in that figure of Adam Overdue one of many windows that Jonson is giving us into the power of festivity. Overdue's trying to fake festivity, and I think what we learn from that aspect of Jonson's play is that there's no such thing as that. You can't fake festivity, and you can't do that because festivity itself is faking. It is pretending to be a different kind of person from what you normally or ordinarily are. Now, as we make our way farther into the fair and farther into Act 2, Jonson introduces us to several more denizens of the fair, and these are traders, people who are setting up stalls or booths on Smithfield for the duration of the fair on August 24th and 25th. They're what we now call pop-up operations, but they occur once a year. In a sense, by that token, these people are kind of at home in the fair. This is the highlight of their year where they make their money. We meet, first of all, a man called Leatherhead, who sells puppets and trinkets of all kinds. We meet a lady called Joan Trash, who sells gingerbread. We meet a couple of minor kind of wandering traders, a costermonger, that's somebody who sells fruit. We meet a man called Nightingale, who is a purveyor of ballads, and this is a very, very interesting and complex and strange kind of history of folk culture thing that we can't really go into. But basically, a figure like Nightingale is somebody to whom you can go up and you can ask for a song, or you can ask him to write a song, a ballad, improvise it on the spot about whatever you want. There's also a news function, a popular news function to ballads. It's a very, very interesting business. For those of you who know anything about this, it's a bit like what are called corridas in northern Mexico. They're news songs. And as we learn, the ballad maker Nightingale also works with the cut purse Ezekiel Edgeworth. So he'll sing a song saying things like, "And if you go to the left and reach far down, you will find the rainbow," because he's telling Edgeworth where to find the purse on one of his victims. So we meet a series of what are called Bartholomew birds, denizens or inhabitants of the fair. It's rather like, if you guys are fans of musicals at all, it's rather like the wonderful, famous scene in the great 60s musical Oliver, where the traders come on one by one singing "Who Will Buy This Beautiful Morning" and all that stuff. We get figure after figure coming on. We get the fair being populated, coming to life. And finally, we have coming on stage the kind of queen of them all. And that, of course, is Ursula, who enters the play on page 74 in our edition. This is Act 2, Scene 2, just after Nightingale has been singing about his ballads. Ursula comes on, saying, "Fie upon't! Who would wear out their youth and prime thus in roasting of pigs that had any cooler vocation? Hell's a kind of cold cellar to it, a very fine vault. Oh, my conscience, what mooncalf! Mooncalf, her servant, says offstage, "Here, mistress." Nightingale speaks to her. Ursula calls for her chair. To Mooncalf, her servant, for her chair. "My chair, you false faucet, you, and my morning's draught. Quickly, a bottle of ale to quench me, rascal. I am all fire and fat, Nightingale. I shall e'en melt away to the first woman, a rib again, I am afraid. I do water the ground in knots as I go, like a great garden pot. You may follow me by the S's I make." Wonderful line, wonderful image. Ursula is kind of like the queen of the fair. The chief trader, the center of the action, and her booth certainly is the center of Jonson's stage action. Her name, Ursula, which is exactly the same as the German name Ursula. Ursula means she-bear. And it so happens that historically Smithfield had been used as a bear baiting ground. Bear baiting being, as you know, a sport where dogs were set on bears, and you would bet to kind of see which dog would last the longest against the bear, that kind of thing. The bear, an ancient animal of English culture, a lost animal, I think, even by this period in early modern England. I don't think you'd find a lot of bears in the forests of England. We can say a totemic animal, the bear, a faunic animal, a kind of embodiment of the country, an embodiment of the land, an embodiment of the earth. Ursula, to put a point upon it, Ursula is the embodiment of the fair, and she runs an establishment, a booth, selling two things. She sells beer and she sells roast pork. And those two things put together, I think, are the very embodiment of the festival. After all, beer gets you drunk, pork gets you full, and really like yummy, greasy, full. Sorry, vegetarians and vegans out there. Placing the emphasis then on the body. And that's something that we have to talk about as we flesh out this concept of the festive, as Jonson is depicting and deploying it for us in his play. Festivity places an emphasis on our bodies, on the physical reality that we are, and the power that our bodies have to kind of turn the tables on us, to take over, becoming the boss of us, whereas we normally think that we are the boss of them, our bodies. We are they, these things that we carry around, the bodies that submit us, put us through various kinds of transformation and distortion that we may invite, that we may sometimes find pleasurable, but that we sometimes find very painful and very horrifying. So Ursula sells beer. What happens when we drink too much beer? Well, of course, we get drunk. We have to pee a lot. We misbehave. We may fight. We're getting out of control. Our body's taking us out of control in that festive space. She sells pork. What happens if we eat too much pork? Well, we get full. We get fat. We may throw up. We have to defecate. This emphasis on the body, which Ursula brings on stage, is a very important qualification and advance in our understanding of what's at stake in the notion and the phenomenon of festivity. And we can introduce two more terms at this point, technical terms, which allow us to talk about Bartholomew Fair as a play and allow us to talk about the phenomenon of festivity that Bartholomew Fair is representing. The first word, and I've put both of these on the canvas page, the first word is scatological. Scatological, from, I guess that's from the Greek root. scat, but we still have that term actually in English as when we see bears scat. We're talking about bear shit, but we're polite and clever about it, so we say bear scat. Scatological, in the strictest sense, scatological means having to do with shit, the logic or the study or the analysis of shit. More broadly, we use that term scatological to talk about everything to do with the sheer, irreducible, unerasable physicality of our being. Everything to do with the bodies that we are, even though we think of ourselves as more than just the bodies that we are. So all bodily fluids, all bodily limits, all bodily embarrassments, these are scatological phenomena. And festivity obviously tends to be heavily scatological. And, Ursula is a site, a focus of scatological activity of all kinds in Jonson's play. The other term that I want to introduce, which I think is even much more important and interesting, is the term carnivalesque. Carnivalesque. And this is a wonderful and extremely useful theoretical term which allows us, again, to kind of give the point of the phenomenon of festivity. We can say that it is carnivalesque. And that simply means that the carnivalesque means involving this rule of the body, this domination by the body, of physical sensual excess and incontinence, losing control of ourselves through our bodies. The kind of thing that happens in the context of carnival, of festive time, festive space. And there's two aspects that I want to highlight about this term, carnivalesque, which, by the way, this term is associated with the 20th century Russian literary theorist Mikhail Bakhtin. We don't need to know that, but it's just worth mentioning. Two things about this term carnivalesque, which come out of Bakhtin's work. First, it's just a fact of culture. So this takes us back to the fundamental recognition of the phenomenon of festivity itself. It's a fact of culture that under the kind of sophisticated, highly developed, rational, progressive activities that we think ourselves to be involved in, and under also the high culture activities that we may recognize as important. Going to the opera, going to Shakespeare, taking a class like English 310. Under all of that stuff, there's a powerful undercurrent or sub-base of the carnivalesque. The culture of the body, the culture of festivity, the culture of scatology, all that stuff. The other aspect of the concept of carnivalesque that we want to emphasize is that the carnivalesque itself involves a kind of moral inversion, an upside-downness of our ordinary moral lives. Not only because when we enter festive space or festive time, we may choose to do things that we know to be wrong, but also because when we choose to do those things that we know to be wrong under festivity, we may in fact either secretly or explicitly advance a claim that they are in fact right. The rightness of wrongness, if we can momentarily at least get a grip on that concept, that's carnivalesque, as though the body, the scatological, the immoral or amoral, the going too far, the getting a bit crazy, as if all of that tasty, spicy ball of festive wax makes its own moral claim. Its claim to be what we really want, what we really find good, what we really want to approve, at least when we are in that festive zone. Now, Ursula, as I've said several times, she's kind of the queen of the fair, the embodiment of the fair, the representation of the fair itself, and as such, she is intensely carnivalesque. She sells beer and roast pork, and she represents the effects of beer and roast pork and her purveying of them. She comes on stage here in the bit that I just read, complaining of the heat. So it's August 24th, the dog days of summer, and even though we can joke about English summers, if you're lucky, a London August can indeed be pretty hot. It's the dog days of summer, and she's going inside to stand in front of a hot fire cooking pork. So heat upon heat. She comes in sweating buckets. Excess, by the way, always being a marker of the carnivalesque, going too far. And in the bit that I read from Act 2, Scene 2, she's complaining about how much she's sweating, and Jonson gives her that very clever little figure about how she says, "I do water the ground in knots as I go, like a great garden pot. You may follow me by the S's I make," a ridiculous, funny hyperbole for how much she's sweating, and at the same time it's also implicitly scatological, as though she's talking about kind of peeing as she goes, water leaking out of her like a great garden pot. Incontinence is carnivalesque. Incontinence is festive. By incontinence, we mean losing control of our bodies. Again, in one way, that's throwing aside a rule, saying, I just don't care. In another way, that incontinence brings with it the possibility of asserting that as a rule of its own. Screw it, I don't care. I'm just going to pee as I walk. That's festive, that's scatological, that's carnivalesque, and that's Jonson's Ursula. And that liquid incontinence then ties back to one of the commodities that Ursula sells, ties back to her beer. The other commodity she sells, of course, is that roast pork, and that too is represented, embodied in Ursula, and there's no point being prim in this play, no point being prim or guarded or politically correct about it. Ursula is fat, and a major element of the festivity that starts to surround Ursula is fat jokes, and they are, I think, pretty amazing. If we turn to Act 2, I'll skip that part. Act 2, Scene 2, Ursula is still haranguing her servant Mooncalf, and she treats him very, very badly. It's almost like a sadomasochistic thing that they have going on. She's complaining to him that the chairs that she has to sit down in are too narrow for her because of how big and heavy she is. But then she really gets into something amazing in Act 2, Scene 5 with Quarles. So Quarles and Windwife, the two characters whom we met in Act 1, two of the characters whom we met in Act 1, come on. They're the first of that group to make it to the fair. And they end up sitting down at Ursula's booth. They don't really want to, but they see this guy Knockham, who basically is a pimp. He knows them both and knows them by name, which is quite telling. They see this guy Knockham, and they try to avoid him, but they fail. So they end up sitting down at Ursula's booth, and we're going to look now at Act 2, Scene 5, round about line 70. Ursula comes on to take a break in her own pub, so she's sitting down having a drink herself. Quarles looks over at her, Act 2, Scene 5, line 71. He says, "Body of the fair, what's this? Mother of the bawds?" Knockham says, no, she's mother of the pigs, sir, mother of the pigs. Quarles at line 74 says, nay, she is too fat to be a fury. Sure, some walking sow of tallow. Tallow being a flammable kind of grease that was used to make cheap candles made from animal fat. And Quarles goes on, he says at line 76, she'll make excellent gear for the coachmakers here in Smithfield to anoint wheels and axle trees withal. How fat is Ursula? She's so fat you can use her to grease wheels and axles. Ursula responds. So they get into this trading of insults. Ursula says at line 79, aye, gamesters, mock a plain, plump, soft wench the suburbs do, because she's juicy and wholesome. You must have your thin pinched wear, pent up with the compass of a dog collar, or 'twill not do, that looks like a long-laced conger set upright, and a green feather like fennel in the jowl on it. They're mocking her for being fat. She mocks them right back for liking skinny chicks. Skinny chicks who were like, and we can kind of paraphrase the highly periodized language here, they're like an eel in a dog collar. What an incredible image. And it goes on. Knockham, who is kind of on Ursula's side, Knockham says, yeah, way to go, Ursula. Way to insult right back. Quarles turns to him at line 86 and says, is she your quagmire, Dan Knockham? Is this your bog? And going on at line 90, Quarles says, yes, he that would venture for it, I assure him, might sink into her and be drowned a week ere any friend if he had could find where he were. Wainwife says, and then he would be a fortnight weighing up again. Quarles says, 'twere like falling into a whole shire of butter. They had need be a team of Dutchmen should draw him out. In this extremely bawdy and scatological moment of the play, Quarles and Wainwife are talking about what it would be like to make love to Ursula. And Quarles, true to his name, Quarles, is doing a great job of coming up with horrendous insults that he is tossing across the pub at Ursula very casually. She's like a bog. You'd sink into her and be lost for a week. Or she's like a whole shire of butter, an incredible phrase. Not just she's like, butter, but a whole shire of butter. Shire means a county. Unbelievable carnivalesque scatology, and note the excess of these insults, these fat joke insults, which, as it were, can't be insulting enough. They keep on getting worse. Accordingly, and sure enough, this part of the scene goes too far. A fight ensues between Quarles and Wainwife on the one hand, Ursula and Knockham on the other, and ultimately there's a kind of amazing comic climax where Ursula goes running into her kitchen. She gets her scalding pan, so that's a piece of kitchen equipment that she uses for, I guess, basically basting these pigs that she's roasting over an open fire. She gets a scalding pan, and in the course of that fight, Ursula herself is injured. But even before that, I want to draw our attention to an incredible moment in Act 2, Scene 5, round about line 111, where the fat joke jokes back. So Ursula has been mocked and insulted by Quarles and Wainwife, and to some extent she's like, yeah, okay, you think I haven't heard that one before? Okay, you're having your fun. Okay, you like those ridiculous skinny chicks, I get it. But at a certain point in this exchange of insults, Ursula gets her own back up, her own temper up, and she starts with venom to insult back. So at line 111, Quarles is saying to Windwife, "Do you think there may be a fine new cucking stool in the fair to be purchased? One large enough, I mean. I know there is a pond of capacity for her." So Quarles' latest joke is the idea of dumping Ursula in the kind of waste pond, the cess pond of the fair. Ursula says, line 114, she says, "For your mother, you rascal, out you rogue, you hedge bird, you pimp, you pan-your-man's bastard, you." Quarles laughs. Ursula goes on at line 116, saying, "Do you sneer, you dog's head, you trendle tail? You look as you were begotten atop of a cart in harvest time, when the whelp was hot and eager. Go snuff after your brother's bitch, mistress commodity." She's saying you look like, she's saying you look like the son of a raped dog, basically. Very, very harsh. And she applies more or less the same insult to Windwife later in the scene. This is line 129. She says to Windwife, "You were engendered on a she-beggar in a barn, when the bald thrasher, your sire, was scarce warm." Vicious, vicious insults. And the point I'm trying to make is not that they don't deserve it, because they do, Quarles and Windwife, they absolutely do. The point I'm trying to make, rather, is that Jonson is depicting for us in a scene like this, Act 2, Scene 1, first of all, the cruelty of comedy, especially this kind of old comedy that Jonson tends to write, which is a comedy of low humor, of victimization, of running gags, and so on. Jonson, first of all, deploys the cruelty of comedy in this scene as Quarles and Windwife make fun of Ursula, and then he picks it apart or exposes it in a way that I think is designed to make us uncomfortable and ought to make us uncomfortable. So when Quarles and Windwife are making fun of Ursula's weight, we probably willy-nilly are finding ourselves laughing along with that. Those jokes are very funny. But when Ursula gets really mad, we see, oh, right, that wasn't very nice, was it? And then her jokes, her insults, as it were, deploy or make clear how less than nice those fat jokes were. She takes the cruelty of comedy and hands it right back to Quarles and Windwife and to us with these several absolutely horrendous images of how they were created. A bald thrasher, so a decrepit ancient peasant begetting Windwife on a she-beggar in a barn. Incredibly harsh jokes. The scene goes from being fun to being harsh, being upsetting. And that, of course, is very much like what typically or all too often happens in Festivity itself. The scene is brilliant, and yet it is also ambiguous, that cop-out term, as to what our stake in the scene, so to speak, is supposed to be, what Jonson wants us to approve or disapprove, or even what he himself approves or disapproves in this astonishingly brilliant and vicious deployment of festive comedy. Okay, I'm going to go on for a little while longer, then we'll wrap up this third lecture, and just one more after this, I promise. I'll just talk very briefly about some other stuff that happens in Act 2. Other people whom we meet, issues Jonson introduces in the remainder of Act 2 and then into Act 3, and then we'll wrap up. Bartholomew first of all, whom we meet again in Act 2, Scene 6. Bartholomew is the guy for whom John Littlewood is drawing up that marriage license at the very beginning of the play. He's going to marry a lovely young woman called Grace Wellborn. And there are some somewhat complicated family relationships here that we need to map very briefly. Bartholomew Coates is going to marry Grace Wellborn. He's supposed to marry Grace Wellborn. Grace Wellborn is the ward of Justice Overdue. And this is a very complex business in the legal structures of the period. Basically, she's like an orphan that he has taken in and is in charge of. He's legally entitled. Justice Overdue. Justice Overdue is legally entitled to dispose of Grace Wellborn, get her to marry whomever he sees fit. Madame Overdue, that's Justice Overdue's wife, obviously. She's Bartholomew's sister. So there's another little complex knot of family relations in this area of Jonson dramatis personae. One of the totally persistent narrative motifs of Jonson's Bartholomew Fair, and a very powerful and important one, is the objectification of women, the sexual objectification and commodification of women. We have at least two characters in Bartholomew Fair who are pimps. Bawds is sometimes the term that is used, but that's the same thing. The man Dan Knockham, whom we have already met, and the Irishman whose name is Whit, whom we meet later on. The female body is represented by Jonson as the most precious, the most vulnerable, the most abused commodity of all those that are for sale in Bartholomew Fair. Justice Overdue, very, very interestingly, in the real world, is also, in a sense, selling a female body. He is disposing of young Grace Wellborn, getting her to marry Bartholomew Coates, who is a very rich man. And accordingly, in a way that he perhaps doesn't recognize, Justice Overdue in the real world is in his own way a bit of a pimp. So this, of course, is a very interesting, very important business. I think it's a business that Jonson really cares about, and is really, really sincerely and powerfully interested in critiquing the sexual objectification and commodification of women, which takes place in Bartholomew Fair. But, of course, as Jonson is also recognizing and asking us to recognize, it takes place in the so-called real or normal or moral world, too. And even a pillar of the community, like Justice Adam Overdue, is actually on his own account engaged in the real world, engaged in the commodification, the selling of a female body, of a female person who is being sold as a sexual object, a reproductive object, ultimately, to Bartholomew Coates. And let's talk a little bit more about him before we wrap up, and then we'll pick up with him next time. Bartholomew Coates is an idiot. He is a glorious, wonderful, brilliant idiot, and one of the masterpieces, I think, of Jonson's imagination. He is very rich and very, very stupid. He is chaperoned throughout the play by his tutor, a very angry man called Humphrey Wasp, to whom Coates refers as Numps. Numps is short for Humphrey. He is a figure of fun. He is a figure of contempt, Bartholomew Coates, I mean. And in the end, of course, he doesn't even get to marry Grace Wellborn, to whom he has been betrothed. But let's just make this the point that we can wrap up on this evening, okay? Bartholomew Coates is a fool and an idiot, and yet, by exactly that token, he's very much at home and kind of wonderfully at home in the fair, in the festive space of Smithfield. Coax is the kind of person who goes through the play, goes through the fair rather, just oohing and awing at everybody, everything and everybody, in complete sincerity. He's the rich guy who comes to Leatherhead's stall, the puppet master and trinket maker, and he says, "This is all so wonderful, I want to buy it all." And he does. He buys all the gingerbread, and he actually comes up with this idea that he has just bought the stuff he needs for his wedding festival at home, all of Leatherhead's trinkets and all of Joan Trash's gingerbread. He's childlike, and the point I'm trying to make is that even though that is contemptible and he's a figure of satire, at the same time in Jonson's play, Jonson represents, I think, Bartholomew Coax's childlike quality as something wonderful. He is marvelously at home in this festive space and time. I've said before in this lecture that festivity, which is always scatological, involves a kind of vector toward incontinence, toward losing control. Losing control of these collected, stable, disciplined people that we normally are. And after all, one of the profound things about festivity, with which we're all familiar, is that we seek, to some degree, loss of control. We may not want it to go too far, but we want it to go a little bit far because that's fun. We like that, and we can even say that we need that to be able to lose control sometimes. Bartholomew Coax is a kind of genius of incontinence. He gets his pocket picked once in the play in Act 2, and he's like, "Oh well, I lost one purse, no biggie." In Act 3, he gets an even bigger purse picked, and again he's like, "Oh, that sucks. Oh well, I guess I'll just go on." He goes through the play kind of losing pieces and parts of himself until he is reduced at the end to a pauper, basically, sitting there in his underwear and his socks watching the puppet play that concludes Jonson's incredible vision in Act 5. And he never complains. For Bartholomew Coax, it seems things can never go too far. That's how wonderful he thinks festivity is. And again, without being able, I think, to determine exactly how Jonson wants us to view that, I think we can say that Jonson wants us to recognize, let's say, the primary claim on our interest, including our moral interest, that is represented by a figure like Coax, who just doesn't really care what happens to him, but is willing, in that festive zone, that carnivalesque space and time, he's willing and even eager to let it all hang out because of that profound moral claim that festivity makes upon us. Okay, that takes us up to another long hour, you guys, so I'm going to stop there. We will do one more lecture on Bartholomew Fair, which I'll have up in a day or two, and that will conclude, so to speak, major combat operations for us in our course. So thank you once again for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.